On November 16th, 1532, in a dusty plaza high in the Andes Mountains, fewer than 200 Spanish soldiers would accomplish something that defied every military principle known to man. They would capture an emperor who commanded 80,000 battle-hardened warriors. They would topple the largest empire in the Americas with nothing more than steel, gunpowder, and a trap so audacious that it would echo through history as one of the most shocking betrayals ever recorded. This is the story of how Francisco Pizarro, a poor pig farmer from the backwaters of Spain, orchestrated the perfect ambush that destroyed the Inca Empire in a single afternoon. What happened at Cajamarca was not just a battle, it was a masterclass in deception, a collision between two worlds, and the moment when the fate of an entire continent was decided by the swing of a sword and the roar of cannon fire. But to understand how Pizarro pulled off this impossible victory, we need to travel back to the moment when opportunity knocked on Spain's door. Because what the Spanish didn't know, as they sailed toward the New World with dreams of gold dancing in their heads, was that their greatest enemy was already destroying itself from within. The year was 1527, and deep in the heart of the Andes, death was stalking the corridors of power. Huayna Capac, the great Inca emperor who had expanded his empire to its furthest reaches, lay dying in his palace in Quito. But this was no ordinary death. This was the kind of death that topples kingdoms and reshapes the world. The invisible killer that claimed Huayna Capac was smallpox, a disease that had traveled faster than any Spanish conquistador ever could. It swept through the Inca Empire like wildfire through dry grass, killing nobles and commoners alike. The emperor himself had never seen a single Spaniard, yet European disease had found him anyway, carried by traders and messengers along the vast network of roads that connected his empire. When Huayna Capac died, he took with him the one thing that held the Inca Empire together: undisputed leadership. He had named his son Ninan Cuyochi as his successor, but fate had other plans. Ninan Cuyochi died of the same plague that had claimed his father, leaving the throne empty and the empire rudderless. What followed was a catastrophe that would make Pizarro's job infinitely easier. Two of Huayna Capac's sons, Huascar and Atahualpa, both claimed the right to rule. Huascar controlled the southern capital of Cusco, the ancient heart of the empire. Atahualpa commanded the northern armies from Quito, fresh from his father's military campaigns. Neither brother would yield to the other, and so began a civil war that would tear the Inca Empire apart at its very foundations. For 5 brutal years, brother fought brother across the length of the Andes. The battles were legendary in their savagery. At Mulihambato, Chimborazo, and finally at Quipaipan, Atahualpa's northern armies proved superior. His generals were seasoned warriors who had learned their craft in his father's conquests. His soldiers were disciplined and fierce, hardened by years of mountain warfare. When the dust settled, Atahualpa had emerged victorious. Huascar was dragged before his brother in chains. The ancient capital of Cusco had fallen, and the empire was united once more under a single ruler. But victory had come at a terrible price. Tens of thousands of elite Inca warriors lay dead on battlefields scattered across the empire. The noble class that had administered this vast realm was decimated. Trust between different regions of the empire had been shattered, perhaps forever. Atahualpa sat on his throne in late 1532, master of the largest empire in the Americas, but ruling over a realm that was exhausted, divided, and bleeding from 5 years of civil war. He had no idea that at that very moment, a small band of Spanish adventurers was already marching through his domain, guided by native allies who had their own reasons for wanting to see the Inca Empire fall. Francisco Pizarro was not your typical conquistador. Born into poverty in the harsh region of Extremadura in western Spain, he had grown up herding pigs and dreaming of something greater. Like many poor Spaniards of his generation, he had heard the stories filtering back from the New World. Tales of Hernán Cortés and his conquest of the Aztec Empire, where a handful of Spanish soldiers had toppled Montezuma and claimed riches beyond imagination. But Pizarro was no young hothead seeking quick glory. By the time he set his sights on Peru, he was already in his 50s, a grizzled veteran who had spent decades in the Americas learning the hard lessons of conquest and survival. He had participated in the brutal campaigns in Panama, where he had seen firsthand how European diseases could devastate native populations. He had witnessed how superior technology and tactics could overcome vast numerical disadvantages. Most importantly, Pizarro had studied the methods that had made Cortés successful in Mexico. The key was not to fight the entire enemy empire at once. The key was to cut off the head of the serpent, capture the emperor, control the empire. It was a strategy that required incredible audacity, perfect timing, and just a little bit of luck. In 1529, Pizarro had returned to Spain to petition the crown for permission to conquer the lands they called Peru. The Spanish monarchy, drunk on the gold flowing in from Mexico, readily agreed. They granted Pizarro the title of governor and captain general of Peru, giving him legal authority to claim whatever territories he could conquer in the name of Spain. By January 1531, Pizarro was ready to make his move. His expedition was small by the standards of European warfare, just 180 men, 27 horses, and 2 small cannons. But these were not ordinary soldiers. They were hardened veterans, many of whom had fought alongside Cortés in Mexico. They knew what they were getting into, and they knew the rewards that awaited them if they succeeded. As Pizarro's tiny army made its way south along the coast of South America, they received intelligence that would change everything. Native informants brought word of the civil war raging in the Inca Empire. They spoke of armies clashing in the mountains, of cities changing hands, of an empire tearing itself apart. To Pizarro, this news must have seemed like divine providence. The Spanish established a base at San Miguel de Piura on the coast, then began their march into the Andes. The terrain was unlike anything they had ever encountered. Narrow mountain paths that dropped away into bottomless gorges, air so thin that men gasped for breath with every step, peaks that scraped the sky, crowned with snow that never melted. But Pizarro pressed on, driven by reports of unimaginable wealth waiting in the highland cities. His men grumbled and complained, but they followed their leader deeper into the mountains. They had cast their lot with Pizarro, and there was no turning back now. As they climbed higher into the Andes, the Spanish began to encounter evidence of the empire they had come to conquer. Roads paved with stone that put European highways to shame, bridges that spanned impossible chasms with engineering that defied belief, terraced fields that turned steep mountainsides into gardens, storage facilities filled with supplies that could feed armies for months. This was no collection of primitive tribes. This was a sophisticated civilization that rivaled anything in Europe. The realization both awed and terrified Pizarro's men. How could fewer than 200 soldiers hope to conquer such a realm? The answer would soon present itself in the form of an invitation that seemed too good to be true. Word had reached Atahualpa of these strange foreigners marching through his realm. Reports filtered back to him of men who rode upon creatures that were half man, half beast. Warriors who wore shells of metal that turned aside spears and arrows, weapons that roared like thunder and spat fire and death. But Atahualpa was not afraid. He was curious. Here was the emperor who had just crushed his brother's armies in battle after battle. Here was the man who commanded 80,000 seasoned warriors, veterans of the bloodiest civil war the Andes had ever seen. What could these few dozen pale strangers possibly do against the might of the Inca Empire? Rather than crush Pizarro's tiny force like an insect, Atahualpa made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his short life. He would meet these foreigners face to face. He would see for himself what manner of men they were. And so he sent messengers to Pizarro, inviting the Spanish to meet at him Cajamarca, a small city nestled high in a valley of the northern Andes. To Pizarro, the invitation must have seemed like a gift from God himself. Here was the enemy emperor, offering to place himself within reach of Spanish steel. But Pizarro was no fool. He knew this meeting could just as easily be a trap. Atahualpa could be planning to surround the Spanish and annihilate them far from any hope of escape. Yet Pizarro also recognized opportunity when he saw it. If he could somehow capture Atahualpa, the entire empire would be his. It was the same strategy that had worked for Cortés in Mexico. Cut off the head, and the body would follow. All he needed was the perfect moment and the perfect plan. On November 15th, 1532, Pizarro and his men crested the final ridge and gazed down into the valley of Cajamarca. What they saw below them defied comprehension. Spread across the valley floor like a sea of humanity was Atahualpa's army. Tens of thousands of warriors arranged in perfect formations, banners fluttering in the mountain wind, the glint of bronze and gold catching the afternoon Sunday. And there, at the center of it all, was the royal camp. Pavilions of the finest cloth surrounded by gardens that had been planted just for the emperor's pleasure. Hot springs that gave the valley its name steamed in the distance. This was not just an army, this was a moving city, a testament to the organizational power of the Inca Empire. Pizarro's men stared down at this overwhelming display of force and felt their courage drain away like water from a broken pot. Some began to mutter about turning back, others spoke of negotiating safe passage home. But Pizarro silenced them with a look that could have melted steel. He had come too far to turn back now, he had noticed. Besides something that his fright had missed, the city. Atahualpa was almost of Cajamarca itself, empty and soldiers chosen to camp outside streets and squares des the walls, leaving deserted. If Pizarro could lure the emperor into the city, away from the bulk of his army, then perhaps the impossible might become possible. That night, as cookfires flickered across the valley like fallen stars, Pizarro gathered his men in the abandoned buildings of Cajamarca. In hushed tones, he outlined his plan. It was audacious beyond measure. It was also their only chance of survival. The Spanish would hide themselves in the buildings surrounding the main plaza. Cavalry would be positioned at strategic points, ready to charge at a moment's notice. The two cannons would be loaded with shot and aimed at the center of the square. When Atahualpa arrived for their meeting, Pizarro would give a signal, and they would strike with everything they had. The plan depended on speed, surprise, and sheer ruthlessness. There could be no hesitation, no mercy. They would have one chance to capture the emperor, and if they failed, they would all die in this mountain valley, their bones picked clean by condors. As dawn broke over Cajamarca on November 16th, the Spanish made their final preparations. Weapons were sharpened and blessed by the expedition's priest. Armor was checked and rechecked. Horses were saddled and readied for the charge that would either make them rich beyond their wildest dreams or see them dead before the sun reached its zenith. Across the valley, Atahualpa was making preparations of his own. But these were preparations for ceremony, not war. The emperor would enter Cajamarca in state, surrounded by his nobles and attendants. They would carry no weapons, save for ceremonial axes that were more decoration than armament. This was to be a diplomatic meeting, a chance for the Inca emperor to satisfy his curiosity about these strange visitors from across the sea. Atahualpa had ordered the bulk of his army to remain outside the city. He would bring only his personal retinue, perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 men, but all of them unarmed. It was a gesture of supreme confidence, the act of a ruler who feared nothing and no one. As the morning sun climbed higher into the thin mountain air, scouts brought word to Pizarro that the emperor's procession was approaching. Golden litters carried by nobles dressed in the finest cloth, attendants scattering flower petals on the ground before their god-emperor's feet, the sound of flutes and drums echoing off the stone walls of empty buildings. Pizarro took his position at the center of the plaza, flanked by a handful of his most trusted men. The rest of his tiny army crouched in doorways and behind windows, fingers tight on triggers and sword hilts. The trap was set. All that remained was for the prey to walk into it. At the appointed hour, the gates of Cajamarca swung open, and Atahualpa entered the city that would become his prison. He was carried on a golden litter by 80 nobles, their shoulders straining under the weight of precious metal and gemstones. Behind him came his retinue, thousands of unarmed Inca nobles and servants, all dressed in their finest regalia for this historic meeting. The emperor himself was a figure of almost mythical splendor. Feathers of exotic birds adorned his headdress. Gold and silver ornaments caught the light with every movement. His very presence radiated the kind of absolute authority that comes only to those who have never known defeat. As Atahualpa's litter was set down in the center of the plaza, a Spanish friar named Vicente de Valverde approached with a Bible in his hands and an interpreter at his side. What happened next would provide Pizarro with the legal justification he needed for what was about to unfold. The friar began to speak, his voice echoing across the silent plaza, as he delivered what the Spanish called the Requerimiento, It was a legal document that had been read to countless indigenous peoples across the Americas, a formal demand that they submit to Spanish rule and convert to Christianity. The interpreter, a man named Felipillo, struggled to translate concepts that had no equivalent in the Inca language. Valverde spoke of a distant king named Charles, of a god who ruled over all creation, of a pope in Rome who held dominion over souls. To Atahualpa, seated on his golden litter surrounded by thousands of his subjects, these words must have seemed like the ravings of a madman. He was the Sapa Inca, the child of the sun, descended from the gods themselves. No earthly ruler could claim authority over him. The friar extended the Bible toward the emperor, explaining that this book contained the word of God and the foundation of Spanish authority. Atahualpa took the leather-bound volume in his hands, turning it over with curiosity. He had never seen writing before. The Inca Empire, for all its sophistication, had no written language. They recorded information using complex systems of knotted strings called quipu, but the concept of marks on paper that could convey meaning was utterly foreign to him. The emperor held the book to his ear, perhaps expecting it to speak as the friar had claimed it would. When it remained silent, he examined the pages, running his fingers over the strange symbols that meant nothing to him. Then, in a gesture that would seal his fate, Atahualpa threw the Bible to the ground in disgust. Valverde snatched up the sacred text, his face flushed with outrage. He turned toward the buildings where Pizarro waited and shouted the words that would unleash hell upon the plaza. Come out, Christians. Come at these enemy dogs who reject the things of God." The signal had been given. There would be no more diplomacy, no more ceremony. The trap was sprung. Pizarro drew his sword and waved a white scarf above his head. From every doorway and window surrounding the plaza, Spanish soldiers emerged like demons from the underworld. The two cannons roared simultaneously, their thunder echoing off the mountain peaks as grape shot tore through the packed masses of Inca nobles. The sound was like nothing the Incas had ever heard, a noise so alien and terrifying that many fell to their knees in shock. The Spanish cavalry charged from 3 directions at once, their horses' hooves pounding against stone as they crashed into the densely packed crowd. The Incas had never seen horses before, and the sight of these armored centaurs bearing down upon them with lances lowered struck terror into their hearts. Some thought they were witnessing the arrival of supernatural beings, creatures from the world of the gods come to exact divine punishment. Steel met flesh in a massacre that defied all military logic. The Incas, packed shoulder to shoulder in the confined space of the plaza, had no room to maneuver, no space to flee. Those who tried to escape found their way blocked by walls of stone on 3 sides and a murderous wall of Spanish steel on the 4th. The slaughter was systematic and merciless. Spanish swords, forged in the furnaces of Toledo and tempered by decades of European warfare, cut through Inca armor made of quilted cotton as if it were paper. Gunshots rang out in continuous volleys as Spanish soldiers reloaded and fired into the helpless mass of humanity trapped in the plaza. Through it all, Atahualpa remained seated on his golden litter, paralyzed by the speed and brutality of the attack. His nobles threw themselves forward to shield their emperor with their own bodies, allowing themselves to be cut down rather than abandon their divine ruler. It was a display of loyalty that moved even some of the Spanish soldiers, but it did nothing to slow their advance. Pizarro himself fought his way through the melee toward the emperor's litter. This was the moment everything depended upon. If Atahualpa escaped or was killed, the Spanish would find themselves trapped in a mountain valley, surrounded by 80,000 furious Inca warriors. But if they could take him alive, the entire empire would be within their grasp. A Spanish soldier reached the litter and raised his sword to strike down the emperor, but Pizarro knocked the blade aside with his own weapon. The conquistador's hand was slashed in the process, the only Spanish blood spilled that day, but his intervention saved Atahualpa's life. With his own hands, Pizarro dragged the emperor from his throne golden and declared him prisoner. The battle, if it could even be called that, lasted less than an hour. When the smoke cleared and the screaming died away, the plaza of Cajamarca looked like a vision of hell. Thousands of Inca nobles lay dead, their blood soaking into the stone beneath their bodies. Not a single Spaniard had been killed, and only Pizarro bore any wound at all. The psychological impact of the massacre rippled outward from the plaza like waves from a stone dropped into still water. The great Inca army camped in the valley heard the thunder of cannons and the screams of dying men, but by the time they could react, it was already over. Their god emperor was a prisoner, and their world had been turned upside down in the space of a heartbeat. For the Incas, the capture of Atahualpa was more than just a military defeat. It was a theological catastrophe that shattered the very foundations of their understanding of reality. The Sapa Inca was not merely their political leader. He was the son of Inti, the sun god, a divine being whose very existence maintained the cosmic order. That such a figure could be seized by mere mortals was inconceivable. Many of the surviving Inca nobles fell into a kind of spiritual paralysis, unable to process what they had witnessed. Some fled back to their home provinces, carrying news of the disaster to every corner of the empire. Others remained near Cajamarca, hoping against hope that their emperor might yet be freed and the natural order of things restored. Pizarro, meanwhile, found himself in possession of the most valuable prisoner in the Americas. Atahualpa was the key that could unlock the treasures of an entire continent, but he was also a liability of enormous proportions. Outside the walls of Cajamarca, 80,000 Inca warriors remained camped in the valley, their loyalty to their captured emperor undiminished by his defeat. The conquistador knew he had to move quickly to consolidate his impossible victory. He allowed Atahualpa to maintain a semblance of royal dignity, permitting the emperor to hold court within the confines of his captivity. Inca nobles were allowed to visit their ruler, bringing him food and attending to his needs as if he were still seated on his throne in Cusco. This calculated show of respect served multiple purposes. It helped prevent the Inca army from launching a desperate assault to free their emperor, and it gave Pizarro time to negotiate what would become the most extraordinary ransom demand in human history. During the long conversations that followed his capture, Atahualpa began to understand the true nature of his captors. These strangers were not gods or supernatural beings. They were men, mortal and fallible, driven by an insatiable hunger for gold and silver that seemed to consume their every thought. The emperor, desperate to secure his freedom and restore order to his shaken realm, made an offer that he believed no mortal man could refuse. He would fill the room where he was imprisoned with gold, stacked as high as he could reach with his outstretched arm. 2 adjacent rooms would be filled twice over with silver. In exchange for this unimaginable treasure, the Spanish would release him and allow him to return to his throne. Pizarro listened to this proposal with the calculating mind of a man who had spent his entire life seeking exactly this kind of opportunity. The room in question was 22 feet long, 17 feet wide, and the line Atahualpa had drawn on the wall stood 9 feet from the floor. The amount of precious metal required to fulfill such a promise would exceed the wealth of European kingdoms. Yet even as he agreed to the terms, Pizarro knew he had no intention of honoring the bargain. Atahualpa, alive and free, would be a rallying point for Inca resistance. The emperor dead would remove the last obstacle to Spanish domination of Peru. The ransom would be collected, but the prisoner would never see freedom again. Word went out across the empire that the Sapa Inca required gold and silver for his liberation. From every province, from every temple and palace, precious metals began to flow toward Cajamarca, like rivers converging on a distant sea. Llama trains wound their way along mountain paths, carrying burdens of worked gold and silver that represented centuries of Inca craftsmanship. The Spanish watched in amazement as the treasure accumulated. Plates and vessels of pure gold, ceremonial knives with jeweled handles, intricate sculptures that had adorned the holiest shrines of the empire. Each piece was a work of art, irreplaceable artifacts that captured the aesthetic genius of Inca civilization. And so, in a single afternoon of unimaginable brutality and breathtaking audacity, the fate of 2 civilizations was sealed forever. Francisco Pizarro, the pig farmer's son from Extremadura, had accomplished what no military strategist would have thought possible. With fewer than 200 men, he had toppled an empire that stretched across a continent, captured a god emperor, and claimed riches that would reshape the balance of power in Europe itself. The melted gold from Atahualpa's ransom would fill Spanish coffers for generations, funding wars and conquests across the globe. But the true cost of Cajamarca could never be measured in precious metals alone. An entire civilization, one of the most sophisticated the world had ever seen, was destroyed in the time it takes the sun to cross the sky. The trap that Pizarro sprung that November day was more than just a military ambush. It was the collision of two worlds, the moment when the age of European expansion reached its most decisive victory. The reverberations of what happened in that dusty plaza high in the Andes would echo through history, shaping the destiny of the Americas for centuries to come. Today, nearly 500 years later, we can still learn from this moment of supreme deception and ruthless calculation. Cajamarca reminds us that empires, no matter how mighty, can fall in an instant when divided from within and faced with enemies who understand the value of perfect timing and absolute surprise. History belongs to those bold enough to seize it, and on November 16th, 1532, Francisco Pizarro seized more history than any conquistador before or since.